And welcome to the Comic Corner. My name is Damon, and what we do here is news, reviews, and interviews. And today we have an Eisner and Ringo nominated author and artist worked with timeless franchises and characters like Popeye, Flash Gordon, Star Trek, Garfield, and if I keep going on, we'd literally run out of time. Ryan Estrada, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And what we do here whenever I have a new guest on, I ask them a very simple question. What's your comic book origin story? How did you, as a fan, get into comics? Because I do understand that you started off pitching comics to local newspapers way back in the day. How'd you start off as a fan prior to that?
Yeah, well, I decided I was going to be a cartoonist before I could speak or before I could make memories. Like as a baby, I just made that decision. I have no idea why. I have no idea how. My mother's just like, yeah, I think you learned to speak so that you could tell me I need to become a professional cartoonist as soon as possible. And then by the time I turned 6, I'm like, I've been doing this long enough. It's time to go pro. Uh, and that's when I started pitching to newspapers. And I bothered the same newspaper until they hired me when I was 16. So it took 10 years of bugging them. But at that time, like as a baby, I think it was mostly newspaper comics that I was reading. And Garfield, of course, was one of my early ones, which is why when I got offered a job to write a Garfield comic recently, I'm like, I literally cannot turn this down, or baby Ryan will learn how to create a time machine, come forward and punch me in the face, because that was all I cared about. Is one day I want to draw Garfield. But yeah, it's always what I wanted to do. I've never had a choice in the matter because baby me made that decision and said, you can never change your mind. But I love it.
What was it about comics as a medium that spoke to you?
I think just comics. I mean, not that I was thinking of this as a kid, but comics is this weird blend of images and pictures, and it's a lot like poetry more than it is like anything else, because you're you have these tiny little boxes, has an image, you have a limited number of words, and it creates the story in your head with so little. Um, and so that's what's always made me excited, that it's an art form where one person can tell a complete story. Years later, I went to school for animation, and I'm like, well, yeah, this is what I want to do now. And as soon as I started doing animation, I'm like, this is terrible. I hate doing this. If I have an idea, I could either spend the next 40 years trying to build my way up in industry until I'm allowed to have a creative thought, and then take that thought and take like 4 years and 800 people making it, or I could just make it tonight as a comic and post it on the internet and be done. And so I love that you can have one artist's full idea, like not filtered through a bunch of people. Not that I don't love collaborating. A lot of my books are collaborations, but it's that you're able to get either one person or a small group telling the story that they want to tell, and not have a lot of people filtering it through test groups and all these things. I like the weirdness of so many comics because of that.
When you were growing up and reading comics, whether it was newspaper, cartoons, or just like the comic books in general, is there a certain artist or writer that you'd always just try to follow whenever they made something new?
Um, as a kid, I like when I went to comic book stores. Early on, it was always newspaper comics. When I went to comic book stores, I was always a little intimidated. Like I love stuff like Gru. I loved comics like that. A lot of licensed comics that I read, but most of the comics when I went there were superhero comics, which really intimidated me as a kid, because every time I picked one up, I'd start off in the middle of a scene and I'd be like, oh, I guess I was supposed to have read what happened before, and then throughout it, I'm like, they're making references to things that I didn't read, and I get to the end, they're like, uh-oh, I got to fight this guy. I'm like, wait, I don't even get to see him fight the guy? Like, what's going on? Like, it always felt like I wasn't invited because I didn't spend 800. Like I only got comics when my parents bought them. Like it's not like I was up on all of these tie-in issues and everything. 800 issues came before it. So not that I didn't appreciate those, I just felt like I couldn't follow them. And so for me, it was, as a kid, it was a lot of the, like I said, the licensed comics, Gru comics and things like that. And then it was later, when I started discovering graphic novels, that I fell in love with artists like Jeff Smith.
Hmm.
Uh, like the Bone series was a one that I fell in love with. And I've always been drawn to stories that are kind of standalone. You can pick it up, get a story. Not that like the story can't continue from there, but give me like a resolution at the end of it.
A story that feels like it has a beginning, middle, and end, and was meant
Yeah.
to be told in a certain way. And you've now out is Garfield, which is very
Hmm.
fun, and that is out with Boom Studios, also under the Kaboom title. How did this opportunity come up? Because I know you mentioned earlier, like this opportunity came up, and like if you didn't take it, like little you would be very, very upset. How did this all come together?
Yeah, I just got an email from the editor. Like I've put myself out there, put out lots of
Mm.
books, and I love, you know, doing licensed comics is something everybody like dreams of, like being able to make the characters you love, but it's often not the best paid work, and it's often not that this Garfield comic turned out great, but in these situations a lot of times it's very low pay, it's very short deadlines, but I love doing these things because it's something that I love being able to have the creative challenge of it. And so I got an email from Boom, and originally what they said is, "Can you do a backup story for one of our Garfield comics?" And I'm like, "Sure." And then they said, "We like this. Can you do a couple more?" So I did two more, and then all of a sudden the marketing came out and it said, "Check out the Garfield comic with the main writer Ryan Estrada." I'm like, "Wait, what? I'm the main writer of this? Okay." Um, and then yeah, so it was wild not knowing that I was the main writer of this Garfield comic, but because it's only a 4-issue miniseries and I did three,
Hmm.
and they made mine the first story of most of them. But yeah, it was fun being able to write like these little stories about the stories I loved as a kid, and they gave me like a series of prompts that were sent by the studio of things that might tie in with the movie, but stand alone. And so I picked a few of those and wrote some fun little silent stories. And it was fun to write a very like contained. All of mine like take place in the house, and Garfield's doing cat stuff. That's the stories that I love. Like whenever Garfield's going to space or something, I'm like, that's not Garfield. That's just a space guy. But this, I got to be like, all the stories I wrote are like, Garfield is very hungry, but the refrigerator is all the way over there. What's he gonna do? That to me is a Garfield story.
That's
The
actually
lowest
just
stakes of like, I'm
yeah.
so sleepy, but I'm so hungry. What do I do? Those are the stories that I love.
I was actually just about to ask, what do you think makes a great Garfield story? So, with all the ones that you've read, from whether it was a kid to you now as an adult, is there one in particular that's just like, this is the perfect Garfield story that you almost like aspire as like the perfect definition of it?
I loved as a kid the Garfield Christmas special. Just because it does have that, like, it feels like the character stakes. A lot happens
Mm.
in it, but John's taking his cat to his parents' house is a story that to me fits with Garfield. Um, but yeah, I mean, I love that, and I as a kid I had some original animation drawings from the Halloween special too, that I bought from a catalog and had on my wall forever, and eventually they got ruined in a flood, and I was very sad. But I love the early specials is what I was into.
What do you think may is the difference in the creation process? Because I know the original like newspaper comic strips, right? That's
Mhm.
what the like the Garfield and all the other classic IPs that you're talking about come from. When you're making a story for that compared to like another IP, like let's say like a Star Trek full comic book,
Mhm.
what's the storytelling process and how does that differ between like your newspaper style strip to like a full book? Like obviously there's less pages, so you have less panels, but how are you able to tell a concise story?
What's funny is Garfield is like the starkest contrast because in the comics, literally, he never like he's on that table with a flat background. It's just a line, and all he ever does is talk about cat stuff. Occasionally, he'll go to the vet. Occasionally, he'll go to the uh, the coffee shop. But those are like the three locations he's allowed to go to, and there are there are times he's gone other places, but we can remember them from 40 years ago because it's so unique. Yet in the like TV shows, it's like he lives in another dimension and he's a superhero and he's like uh it's wild how different they are, because I think Jim Davis is like uh we need something like, we need something else here. But I really, like I said, I really like it when they're grounded. But yeah, there's difference when you're adapting something that is like, if you're doing something with Star Trek or like an adventure story, there are so many possibilities. There's so much lore, and you got to try to figure out like, how can I fit all that in? Like, what do I include? What do I not? And then there's things like where you're adapting. When you look at a movie of like when they adapt, like some toy that doesn't really have lore behind it. It's just like, like if you tried to adapt like Asteroid or something like that. Okay,
Yeah.
well, it's dots moving each other, so you can invent new things and you try to build out. So there's always a challenge, and especially with doing licensed stuff, there's a challenge in what you're allowed to do, because there's very different approaches that people have, and how much control a creator can have over stuff. I've been lucky that a lot of the stuff I've done with licensed characters, like especially with Popeye and Flash Gordon, and Star Trek, has been about like, we've made our version of this. The whole point of this is, let's see what weird things people can make with this IP. And I got zero. Like when I did Flash Gordon, I'm like, hey, is it okay if in the first panel someone calls Flash Gordon a weird dork? And they're like, yeah, sure. I'm like, yes. But I know people that have worked on stuff where it's like they're working on an adaptation of a TV show, and they need to get every single actor's opinion on every likeness they draw, and back and forth and back and forth. And there's one particular project recently that I had to dream project that I had to turn down because I was working with an editor. That editor got laid off, and someone else came on, and they threw out my entire outline and like, hey, we changed this, we rewrote it ourselves. And I just did not like what they wanted me to do. And I'm like, I hate that I have to do this, but I'm dropping out because I don't want my name on this.
How challenging is it working with editors, like in general? Because sometimes they can give you pushback, but I feel like there's a lot of collaboration there outside of that one example you just did. But how generally is the collaboration when you have that IP title going on to it?
Yeah. My experience as editors has almost always been amazing, especially like in my creator-owned stuff. Like a lot of people are afraid of getting notes, but every note I've ever had makes my work better. With like licensed things, it, like I said, it really depends on what the project is and like who has control. And a lot of time it's the owners of the IP that have that control, and they pass it down to the editors who have to like pass on the bad news. And like I said, I think one of the main things, if someone's approached to do this, the main question to ask is, am I allowed to create lore? Which it sounds like a big thing, but there's a matter of like I'll say the project that I was talking about was a cookbook, and that I had to quit, and about a set of characters. And so they were talking about some of the cookbooks are like, it's a story where like, there's, one of them where someone finds a magical book in the forest, and all the characters come and they find out and they put their favorite recipes in it. And then some of them are just like they're talking about, there's a Seinfeld cookbook where Seinfeld's like, you are not allowed to say anything about you can't say Jerry likes this cookie because that is creating lore. Whereas like, so they have to be like, this is a cookbook about the television show Seinfeld. Here are some recipes related to the television show Seinfeld. So like, and that happens even if you're telling a fictional story. It's like, you need to specifically fit in things we have already said about this property. And whereas sometimes you're like, can I be creative and get weird? So that's really what the deal is working with editors, is how much am I allowed to put myself into this? And so sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. I have so many funny stories that I really shouldn't tell publicly, but there have been some wild times.
It is fascinating, the concept of lore that exists and whether it is out there on the internet for you to find or you read it a long time ago and you're like, this happened once, we can go back to it, or not, or you just have to say, yeah, this is something that is based off of a title of a show and here we go from there. Onto the creative process. I am interested. Like, how does your creative process work when you're doing these stories with these licensed products?
Yeah, I my that's what my brain does naturally. Like I just
Yeah.
as soon as I see something, I'm like, what would I do? I actually ran a blog for a while. It was a very short period. I ran a blog called Unlicensed where people would pitch me, what would you do with this property? And I'd
Oh,
write a
that's
whole
cool.
pitch. And I had to stop doing it because I got so in love with everything I wrote and I put so much effort to it and I knew I could never write it. So I'm like, I gotta literally stop putting these out publicly because I want to make them. Um, but yeah, I love when I think about something, I think about like what is it that I love about this property and what are the core like values of it and ideas of it and like what how could I take that in a unique way? And also you got to think about where is this property in people's minds right now. Sometimes when you do something, if the main idea of it is like something that kind of has been lost, like the first I did a Garfield comic a long time ago for a smaller company, and for that one for me was about like all of my favorite characters when I was a kid are no longer in the comic. They haven't appeared in the comic since like 1987 because Jim Davis one day in 1980 late 1980s was like, you know what, we only need 3 characters, let's get rid of all these. So I was like, I want to bring back all these characters and see how much I can do with them, because they haven't been seen in a long time. And sometimes there's a property like that where uh, maybe recent installments of it have gotten really twisty and they've introduced more characters and more lore. And you're like, I want to get down to what it used to be. Whereas sometimes there are properties that maybe haven't stretched their legs a lot, and you're like, I want to do something unique uh, and add more lore. I want to add more twists and turns and do something new. So you got to think about what it is you love about it and what it is that hasn't been done either yet or in a long time, and just whatever you're passionate about. I think the best thing is with licensed comics. For me, the best ones are where they give the creators freedom to do something new, because it's like if you're adapting something into a licensed comic, there's obviously already a thing, it already exists. Why not let the comic be something unique and new? So that's what my thing always is, and trying to uh, you know, make it appeal to fans of it, but also give them a reason to read it. Because if it's just exactly like what came before, but it's not allowed to make any twists or turns, what's the point of reading it?
Absolutely agree with that. I've seen plenty of comics or just books in general that are about, like, let's say like a TV show, and it's like, oh cool, I like that show, maybe this expands on the, oh no, this is just a one for one retelling in a comic book form. Sure. So I don't know, I wouldn't see like the fun in that. So at least in this case, like, you're telling a different story, you're telling your own story, you're adding more fun to it in its whole. Is there a character? I mean, you don't have to go into specifics if it's one that you may really really want to. Is there a character or like a franchise, whatever in particular, you haven't worked with yet? They're like, that's one I absolutely have to do.
There's so many of those, but there's one in particular that I actually wrote the comic just for to entertain myself. I desperately want to write a book about John Wick's dog. um, I've written one, not the first
Oh my
dog. That's a sad
goodness.
story. The second, where in the second movie he gets another dog, and I'm not even particularly into John Wick. I really like the first movie, and I get kind of bored with the later ones. But in the second movie, he gets a new dog and he leaves it at the hotel. And I've written this entire comic series about what happens to that dog at the hotel in between when he drops it off and when he picks it up again. That I really really want to make, and it would be so much fun. It's like this whole entire action movie of the people trying to protect this dog during the shootout, because they're like, I don't want to be the guy responsible for killing John Wick's second dog. And so it's kind of like a bloody action movie version of like the old Chuck Jones comic Feed the Kitty, where the big bulldog's trying to protect the kitten. It's like that, except the stakes are John Wick will find out I killed his dog.
That's amazing. That needs to be pinched
I want it. I want
instantly.
I and that's the other issue with licensed comics is you can't pitch them because
That's true.
there's like there are rules of like you can't if that you send them a pitch like literally you can't work with them because
Hmm.
if like especially working with someone's property like they're you're from their starting point there's only so many ways you can go, so if you pitch to someone I want to do this story, then if they do anything ever similar they have to worry about me coming and being like, hey, I pitched that to you,
Hmm.
and they're like, yeah, it's based on our thing that we made. But that's why you can't really pitch. You kind of got to hope that editors come to you. But yeah, I know the licensing rights for that bounce around a little bit. I'm like, I wish they would come to me and let me do that.
That's amazing. That would sell out. That is a 10 out of 10 idea. Absolutely a 10 out of 10 idea. Oh my goodness. What advice do you give to any young
Yeah, a lot of
aspiring?
the
Oh yeah, go
license.
ahead.
Sorry,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say a lot of the a lot of license ideas that I come up with, especially like back when I did that blog, I end up like reusing them. Like I sand off the edges, or sand off the. Yeah, I turn them into my own thing. Like a long time ago,
Mm.
there was a Terminator licensed comic I was obsessed with making. And then I just kind of like, well, why don't I just not call them Terminators and I can make up my own thing? And I wrote a novel that I'm trying to figure out what to do with. But with the John Wick one, it's like it only works with the baggage of everyone in the world knows what happens when you kill John Wick's dog. So there's some that
Hmm.
you can't turn into your own thing because it's very specifically about this one thing. But yeah, sorry, go ahead with your question.
No, you need that added context when it comes to the John Wickness of it all. You
Yeah.
absolutely do because there's just some guy. It's like it's just some guy. It's John Wick. It's John Wick. You don't want to mess with that dog. You absolutely do not want to mess with that dog. What advice do you give to any young aspiring artists or writers coming up, either trying to break into just like the cartoonist space or the writing space? What a bit of advice do you give to them?
Uh, my number one bit of advice I always give is if you tell me you're an aspiring cartoonist, I should shut up. No, you're not. You're a cartoonist. What are you talking about? Like, it's not like it's not a doctor. And then the second thing is make the work that only you can make.
Mm,
Uh, don't look it out and say like, well, I go to the comic book store and everything's superhero, so I have to make superheroes.
mhm.
That's a terrible idea because there are a billion people making superhero comics and they are very talented at it. They are very passionate about it. And if you are the 846th person putting out a superhero comic book this month, and that's not what you're passionate about, it's going to suck and no one's going to buy it. But for me, the comic that got me Oscar, not or not Oscar, that was nominated for an Oscar, Eisner nominations and Ringo nominations, was a book about my wife's experiences being hunted down by the police in college. No one else was going to make that book. My series Student Ambassador is about inspired by my experiences traveling around the world as a kid and wanting to solve mysteries. Like it's all based on places that I traveled. No one else is going to make that book. And if like even if you have an idea that's so niche, everyone's like, you can't make that. No one will buy it. Like if you have a weird niche dorky hobby, like I don't know if you like making model boats. I try to come up with a different example every time, but like everyone's like, yeah, but nobody else is gonna be into that. The people that are into that, that is going to be their favorite comic they have ever seen in their life because it's something that they care about.
Yep.
And like set a whatever your favorite hobby is, like set a murder mystery at a convention, make a romance between two people to meet doing that hobby at a park, and you are gonna there are now that we have the internet and like you don't have to make something everyone loves because if there are like 100 people in the world that are into that hobby, they will find your comic and they will be obsessed with it and they will buy everything. And then it can grow from there and find people that aren't interested in that hobby but are interested in the story you're telling. So just get weird. Make the stuff that only you can make.
I absolutely love that for two reasons. One, some of my favorite comics ever are just have absolutely nothing to do with superheroes. I mean, like we have monster stuff. We got like, for example, like Zoe Thorogood's book just about her life over like a 12-month span is fantastic, and that has absolutely nothing to do with like anything superhero related, but also just the fact that you'd mentioned on interests, because one of my favorite mangas, which is a comic in a way, is literally about two people working at an aquarium. That's the whole thing. And that's part of like my self-interest. So I was like, this is the most amazing thing ever. I never think I'd ever see anything like this. And it was done so well because it was made by people who done that as a volunteer at some point in their life. And I just thought it was absolutely phenomenal. So I totally agree with that. Like, go make something that you're interested in, that like, maybe there's a handful of people that also share that same experience, because then like those people, like you mentioned, will say, this is amazing, and just be absolutely all in. So totally agree with that. That is amazing advice. Before we get going, as we mentioned earlier, Garfield out now. Go get it. You can pick it up at your local comic shop. You can get it digitally, wherever you get your comics. Absolutely go get it. Ryan, where can people find anything else you've worked on, or is there any other projects that you're working on currently?
Yeah, if you go to ryanestrada.com, everything you need is there. Social media links, comics, everything. There's information about my comic books, and also there are just thousands of pages of totally free comics you can read, full graphic novels you can read. My next book is called No Rules Tonight. It is out from Penguin Workshop. It comes out October 2nd, and it is about in the 1980s in Korea, there was a dictator, and there was a curfew that anyone out after midnight would go to jail. And the only exception to that was, because it was originally started by American soldiers, was December 24th. And so that was the one night that anyone could do whatever they wanted. It was a night of like going out, wild partying, debauchery, and breaking all the rules. So it's a Christmas story about a country that doesn't celebrate Christmas. And it's about what would you do with one night of freedom. It was a really fun one, so I hope people check that out. But Band Book Club, my Student Ambassador series, I do so many things. Check it all out at ryanestrada.com.
That sounds fantastic. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. Again, go check out Garfield, which is out at your local comic shops now, out digitally, wherever you get your comics, because Ryan's story is very, very fun. And you get to see Garfield just wake up for a midnight snack every day. And will he succeed? Will he not? I don't know. You're going to have to read it to find out. That's been this issue of the Comic Corner. You can find me on Twitter at Damon Tweet. You can find the show on Twitter. It's always going to be Twitter to me, at Comic Corner Pod. And you can find our TikTok at Comic Corner Pod as well. And you can follow all the Agents of Fandom at Agents Fandom on Twitter, at Agents of Fandom on Instagram, and at Agents of Fandom on Threads, if anyone's on Threads, and Agents Fandom on TikTok. Woo! We just had like a 1.8 million viewed video on TikTok, which is like our most ever, which is crazy. So go check that out if you want to see all these Marvel celebs down the Hollywood Walk of Fame when Kevin Feige's getting his star. Fun times ahead. That'll do it for this issue of the Comic Corner. Once again, thanks for coming on, Ryan. Go visit your local comic shops and go read some comics. Until next time.